Giving out 1 pawn, 2 pawns to 3 pawns in the opening is out of the regular opening strategies. However, to explore wider fields of attack, one should study and understand Gambit opening styles. To improve your game style from the boring opening setups, you will need to add challenging opening repertoires to your collection. In 7 chapters, I will introduce ideas in an aggressive opening, the Danish Gambit. The Danish Gambit is the variation of the center game that is important enough to be treated on its own. The Danish Gambit starts with pawn to e4, e5 by black, a traditional response, which white will challenge right away with an aggressive pawn to d4. White has offered a pawn. Black has options to either capture the pawn on d4 or decline with the moves like d6, or knight to c6, or knight to f6, or even pawn to f6. However, if black goes for pawn to d6, pawn takes the pawn takes the pawn, queen takes the queen. After king takes the queen, black has lost the right to castle. Since black would love to keep his right to castle, he would not want his king stuck in the center, so he would not prefer this variation. In the case of knight to c6, after d5, knight to d4, c3 traps the knight. If black plays f6, black opens the light square diagonal towards the king, which could be a path to attack the black king for white. In the case of knight to f6, pawn takes on e5, knight takes on e4, queen to d4 is aggressive. Black may not go for all this variation. There is still an option with pawn takes the pawn in the center. If black plays this is called the accepted variation. White should continue with c3. White offers another pawn. Pawn takes on c3, bishop to c4. This move is offering black a third pawn, a triple gambit in just 4 moves. If pawn takes the pawn on b2, bishop takes the pawn on b2. From this position, we can draw the following conclusions. For the price of gambling pawns, white has gained space advantages, rapid piece development, and center control. The pawns cover this square and this square. The bishops are on attacking position, very aggressive. Bishop on c4 attacks f7 pawn. Bishop on b2 attacks g7 pawn. White's plan is to develop the knight later into the game and can castle his king faster than black. White followed opening principles with a touch of gambit style included. Look at black pieces and pawns. They lack development. They are still in their initial positions after just a pawn move. The queen, the bishop, the knight, and the rook are still dormant. Black has couples of responses. Some of them are d5, knight to f6, knight to c6, bishop to b4 check, queen to e7, queen to j5. We are going to look at these responses in this video. This is the end of chapter 1. Let's continue shortly in chapter 2. In chapter 2, we are going to start with a response, d5. In this position, white should just pick up the pawn with the bishop. Black wants to take advantage of the fact that he has an extra pawn and deprive white from castling by chasing the bishop with pawn to c6, attacking this bishop. White has a resourceful sacrifice with bishop takes the pawn on f7 with check. If king takes the bishop, queen is gone. If black proves stubborn and play king to e7 instead, bishop to a3 checks the king. King is forced to capture the bishop. The queen is gone. In this position, we saw where black played pawn to c6. However, what if black plays knight to c6 instead? Queen to b3 is aggressive. This creates pressure towards the f7 pawn. In chapter 3, we are going to look at a different response, which is bishop to b4 check. However, knight to c3 is the way to go. If knight to f6, knight on g to e2. Seems like white blunders this pawn because this knight is pinned to the king. If black goes ahead to pick that pawn, he runs into trouble after white castled. Knight takes the knight, knight takes the knight. Here, black will love to keep the king away from the center and he castles. In this position, there is knight to d5. White prepares an attack with queen joining forces with this bishop to checkmate on this square using this long diagonal. So, if black chooses to stop the queen from coming there, we have a resourceful sacrifice with knight to f6. Pawn takes. Here, queen jumps into the game by going to g4, checking the king. King to h8, queen to h4, threatening to pick up this pawn with the bishop, checking the king and also attacking the queen. Bishop to e7, supporting defending. Bishop to d3. After h6, queen takes on h6 check, king to g8, queen to h7 is checkmate. In this position, if black doesn't continue with knight to f6, black has knight to c6. There is knight to f3 for white, opening up that square so the king can be castled to safety in a shorter time. This is by black. White castles the king to safety. After knight to f6, knight to d5 is simply crushing. This move is tricky. Check it out. If black takes this pawn instead, knight takes the bishop, knight takes the knight, then queen to a4 check. If knight goes back to block the check, we have a strategic bishop sacrifice, taking the pawn, luring the king and making black not to have the right to castle. Then queen can take the knight on e4. If knight chooses to take the knight instead, take the knight with the pawn, attack this knight. The knight has few squares to go to. If knight goes here, queen to a4 checks the king and pick up the bishop. Same idea applies where knight goes to this square instead. Then queen to a4 check, blocking with the bishop, then queen takes the bishop. Well, the bishop attacks this diagonal, the queen attacks this pawn. In this position, you will notice that white has more active pieces than black. In this position, we have checked out knight to f6 and knight to c6. However, let's take it back some moves. After this check from the bishop, we saw knight to c3. Let's have a twist of variation where knight goes to d2 instead. If knight to f6, knight on g to f3, seems as if we blunder this pawn again. If knight takes the pawn, here white just castle the king to safety, inviting the rook to come into the game via this e-file. If knight takes the knight on d2, rook to e1 comes up with check first. Bishop to e7 blocking, queen should take that knight. Queen to d5 is a threat, joining forces with the bishop to attack f7 square. The bishop here on b2 attacks g7. However, the knight is preparing to go to g5 and put pressure on this square. This bishop at this moment is pinned by the rook. So, white has series of action towards the black pieces. In this position, to solve black problem, black will love to castle away from the center. For now, black is appearing safe. Here, white has a resourceful rook sacrifice, with rook takes the bishop on e7. If queen takes, then rook to e1 attacking the queen. If black tries to exchange the queen, queen to g5 is threatening. The threat is to come over to this square by taking the pawn and making a checkmate. Queen to g6 defending, bishop takes that pawn on f7. If queen takes, rook to e7 is threatening to checkmate in the next few moves. However, if rook takes that bishop, rook to e8 check, rook to f8 blocks the check, rook takes on f8 check, king takes on f8, queen to d8 check, queen to e8, bishop takes that pawn, trying to lure the king to take the bishop so that the queen can be captured. However, if the king goes to f7, queen to f6 check defended by the bishop, king to g8, bishop to h6, queen is planning to storm into this place and make a checkmate. Queen to f7 defending, queen to d8 check, queen to f8, here, queen takes the queen on f8 is checkmate. In chapter 4, we are going to look at a different response from this position. We have checked a response with pawn to d5. We have also seen a response with bishop to this square. Let's check out a different response this time around. Let's go with queen to e7. White can simply continue with knight to c3, defending this pawn in the center, at the same time developing that knight from this dormant square. Queen to c5 threatens to pick this bishop. However, bishop back to b3 is okay. White has an active position. The bishops are still doing well. Then the knight is active, preparing to come into the game. Then very soon, knight will be developed, king will be castled, rook will come, queen will be developed, and we have the rook into the game. However, there are different approaches aside from this variation. After queen to e7 and knight to c3, there is c6, trying to stop this knight from coming into the game and harassing the queen. However, knight to f3, d5, bishop to d3, bishop to g4. Here, white should just castle. After d4, attacking the knight, knight sacrifice is allowed because we want to open this fight to attack the queen that is standing in front of the king. If pawn takes, rook to e1 first. The threat is clear. Black king is unsafe. He is still in the center. White has a threat to pin the queen to the king if this pawn takes later on in the game. So, let's check out another response on move 6. We've seen c6. We have seen c6 and we saw the outcome. Let's look at d6 this time around. With d6, knight to d5 is possible, attacking the queen. We are inviting black to take the pawn. Here, we check. We can still block with the knight and the game can continue. However, we are just pushing the queen around on the board, whereby the other pieces are delayed in development. Well, if queen to d8 instead, still keeping eye to protect this pawn in this position. Knight to e2, c6, attacking the knight, knight to e3, knight to f6. Here, white can just simply castle. White have active position. So, from this position, we have seen different responses. The first, we saw queen to d square. Secondly, we saw pawn to c6, and we saw pawn to d6. Let's check out another variation in this chapter 4. Let's go with knight to f6, attacking this pawn. This knight joins forces with the queen to pressure this pawn here on e4. However, knight on g to e2 makes sense. If d5, knight takes on d5, knight takes on d5, bishop takes on d5. After bishop to e6, you notice there's a weakness here on b7. White can simply take. What I would advise to play is castling, keeping the king away from the center. In no time, if black takes and pawn takes, we are going to reroute the knight very soon and bring in the rook into the game to threaten the queen in front of the king. In chapter 5, we are going to see a different approach after bishop takes the pawn on b2. This is the classical defense with knight to f6 right away. Knight to c3 is a way to go. If d5, knight takes on d5, knight takes on d5, bishop takes on d5, knight to d7, bishop takes the pawn on f7 check, king takes, queen to h5 check. Here, black has a couple of responses which include g6, which will provoke queen to d5 check. If king moves to e8, bishop takes the rook, and white is doing better. In this position after queen to h5 check, there is also king to e6. Here, white will just castle the long side so that the rook can join the attack on this particular file. g6 followed, queen to d5 check. After king to e7, king to b1 is very important. You see, the knight here cannot move away because the queen will be captured on d8. However, rook has no escape squares. Black is messed up and white is very active. In this position here, white has attacked the king and this is check. Black would do a very grave mistake if he goes to g8 because queen to d5 is absolute checkmate. In this position, we saw pawn to d5 right away. However, there is bishop to b4, which pins the knight. Well, we have seen this kind of variation before. What we need to do is follow up and practice what we have seen in the previous chapters. Knight on g to e2 is the way to go. Knight takes the pawn, castle your king to safety. Knight takes on c3, knight takes on c6. From this position, the last variation we saw, there was a castling by black. However, After castling, white has room to play this, and the game did not end well for black. So let's see. This variation featured where the bishop takes that knight on c3. Bishop takes. Black sees that the king is still in the center and decides to castle to safety. Queen to g4 is a good way to go. Now the pressure is on g7, preparing to checkmate. If g6, queen to d4, and the checkmate is unstoppable. In chapter 6, after bishop takes the pawn on b2, queen to g5 is another kind of response. Well, in this position, just play knight to f3. This move attacks that queen there on g5 and is inviting the queen to pick up this pawn. However, that pawn is a poison pawn. If queen takes it, see how we're going to capture the queen. Just play your rook to g1. Well, black can throw bishop to b4 check first. Move your king up and the king is safe. Now the queen is still under attack. If queen goes to h3, we have a spectacular bishop takes the pawn on f7 with check. King takes, knight attacks the king and the queen by moving to g5. King to f8, knight takes the queen, and black has just lost the queen to gain 2 pawns and a bishop. This is really bad. In this position, after giving the bishop by taking that pawn on f7, the king doesn't have to take. The king can just move to d8. Well, we have a variation that wins here. Bishop takes the pawn on g7. If the knight goes to e7, knight to g5, the move attacks the queen. What to do? If the queen runs away by picking this pawn on h2, knight to e6 is checkmate, since the queen does not defend that square again and this pawn is pinned by the queen to the king. So, the queen does not have to capture that pawn. Remember in this variation here, after knight to f3, the queen doesn't have to take this pawn. What if the queen goes to a square like this? c5, attacking the bishop. Well, we can develop the knight on b to d2. Knight to c6, white will castle. Since rook to c1 is coming, threatening to play a discovered attack, black can go to somewhere else like this square, and queen to b3 is simply attacking and reinforcing action on f7. In chapter 7, which is the final chapter in this video, we're going to see a different idea entirely. All the other variations we have been seeing involve pawn taking this pawn and bishop taking that pawn and focus on this long diagonal. However, black decided to try a different idea with bishop to b4 straight up. Black's plan is to play a discovered check to attack the queen by pushing this pawn, a check on the king, and he can pick up the queen in the next move. White will spoil this idea by playing pawn takes the pawn, attacking the bishop. If bishop to e7, queen to d5 is simply winning. The queen joins forces with the bishop to attack this f7 square, and if queen takes that pawn, that is checkmate. So black will try to stop this. If black goes with knight, bishop should just take that knight. Pawn takes, queen takes this pawn, and this is checkmate. However, if black tries d6, queen takes the pawn on f7 check, king to d7, bishop to e6 check, king to c6, knight to f3, bringing another attacker into the game. The threat is to throw this knight here to d4, check the king, and beautiful stuffs can happen. However, black will try to stop this by taking that bishop, removing one attacker in the picture. Queen takes the bishop on e6, bishop to f6, trying to stop this knight from coming to d4. There is bishop to g5 that will sway that bishop away. Then knight can go to d4 with check. If king to b6, queen to b3 is check. If king to a5, queen to b5 is checkmate. However, after queen to b3 check, king goes to c5, trying to make things difficult. There is queen to d5, which checks the king. King to b6, queen to b5 is checkmate. Do not forget to try Danish Gambit sometimes. To see interesting lines in the Evans Gambit, watch this video right away.